Hey everyone, welcome to episode 63. Today we will be reading Numbers 33. So, happy Memorial Day to everybody. Today is a day where we thank all the men and women who fought for us through the Italian World War II. World War I. Yes. We'd like to thank all the people who have died for us. Yes. All the people who have died for us, who have sacrificed their lives to save us. A moment of silence. So let's get started for today's Bible reading. These were the stages of the Israelites' journey when they went out of the land of Egypt by the military divisions under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. At the Lord's command, Moses wrote down at the starting for the pages of their journey. These are the stages listed by their starting points. They traveled from Ramesses in the first month on the 15th day of the month. On the day after the Passover, the Israelites went out defiantly in the sight of all the Egyptians. Meanwhile, the Egyptians were burying every firstborn male the Lord had struck down among them. For the Lord had executed judgment against their gods. The Israelites traveled from Ramesses and camped at Succoth. They traveled from Succoth and camped at Etham, which is on the edge of the wilderness. They traveled from Etham and turned back to Pi-hahiroth. Hahiroth, which faces Baal-zephon, and they camped before Migdol. They traveled from Pi-hahiroth and crossed through the middle of the sea into the wilderness. They took a 3-day journey into the wilderness of Etham and camped at Marah. They traveled from Marah and came to Elim. There were 12 springs and 20 date palms at Elim. So they camped there. They traveled from Elim and camped at the Red Sea. They traveled from the Red Sea and camped in the wilderness of Sin. They traveled from the wilderness of Sin and camped in Dophkah. They traveled from Dophkah and camped at Alish. They traveled from Alish and camped at Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. They traveled from Rephidim and camped in the wilderness of Sinai. They traveled from the wilderness of Sinai and camped at Kibroth Hattaavah. They traveled from Kibroth Hattaavah and camped at Hazeroth. They traveled from Hazeroth and camped at Rithmah. They traveled from Rithmah and camped at Rimmon Paris. They traveled from Rimmon Paris and camped at Libnah. They traveled from Libnah and camped at Rizah. They camped from Rizah and camped at Kelath. They traveled from Kelath and camped at Mount Shepher. They traveled from Mount Shepher and camped at Haradah. They traveled from Haradah and camped at Machpelos. They traveled from Machpelos and camped at Taha. They traveled from Tahath and camped at Terah. They traveled from Terah and camped at Mizpah. They traveled from Mizpah and camped at Hashmonah. They traveled from Hashmonah and camped at Moseros. They traveled from Moseros and camped at Bein Jaakan. They traveled from Bein Jaakan and camped at Hor Haggidgad. They traveled from Hor Haggidgad and camped at Jotbatha. They traveled from Jotbatha and camped at Abrona. They traveled from Abrona and camped at Ezion-Geber. They traveled from Ezion-Geber and camped in the wilderness of Zin, that is Kadesh. They traveled from Kadesh and camped at Mount Hor, on the edge of the land of Edom. At the Lord's command, the priest Aaron climbed to Mount Hor and died on the first day of the 5th month, in the 14th year of the Israelites. The first day of the 5th month of the 14th year after the Israelites went out of the land of Egypt. Aaron was 123 years old when he died on Mount Hor. At that time, the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, in the land of Canaan, heard the Israelites were coming. They traveled from Mount Hor and camped at Zalmonah. They traveled from Zalmonah and camped at Punan. They traveled from Punan and camped at Oboth. They traveled from Oboth and camped at Abram, on the border of Moab. They traveled from Aim and camped at Dibon-Gad. They traveled from Dibon-Gad and camped at Almon Diblathaim. They traveled from Almon Diblathaim and camped at the Abram range facing Nebo. They traveled from the Abram range and camped on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. They camped by the Jordan of Beth Jeshimoth to the Acacia meadow on the plains of Moab. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab, by the Jordan across from Jericho. Tell the Israelites, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you must drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Destroy all their stone images and cast images, and demolish all their high places. You are to take possession of the land and settle in it, because I have given you the land to possess. You are to receive the land as an inheritance, by lot according to your clans. Increase the inheritance for a large clan, and decrease it for a small one. Whatever place the lot indicates for someone will be this. You will receive an inheritance according to your ancestral tribes. But if you don't drive out the inhabitants of the land before you, those you allow to remain will become barbs for your eyes and thorns for your sides. They will harass you in the land where you will live, and what I had planned to do to them, I will do to you. Reflection. Wilderness wanderings. We met with an immigration attorney, to be sure. He informed us that once we got a work visa, we could apply for our green cards to become permanent residents. It seemed relatively easy at the same time. Moving from Canada. My brother and other Canadian friend both became permanent residents in less than 2 years. When my husband's employer agreed to sponsor his green card, we settled into our American life and waited expectantly. Then 9/11 happened. One of the fallouts of that horrific day was that all green card applications were halted indefinitely. It was the beginning of our wilderness wandering. The economy quickly spiraled into a mission where we became fearful of losing our jobs, which could require us to promptly leave the country. Wilderness experiences test our faith. Maybe your wilderness experience is broken, empty marriage. Maybe it's a wayward child. Maybe it's watching a loved one endure unimaginable physical pain through a chronic illness. We pray repeatedly for God to change the circumstances. How long, Lord? For months, I researched every possible avenue to expedite our green card application. Finally, this type of personality had to accept the hard reality. I could not fix it. I had to give it over to God. Day after day, the Lord sent the manna of His sweet presence to provide for us in the wilderness. Many times I lost hope, but hope always came to assure me when He was with us. When I am faithless, God is always faithful. Just before Christmas, in our 10th year in the U.S., I felt a sense of panic as I pulled into my garage. I realized that my work visa was set to expire in a few months. If we didn't hear about our green cards before the expiration date, I would have been permitted to work once again. I prayed and cried out to God. Later that week, we received the long-awaited news. Our green cards had finally been approved. We were overjoyed. As I stared at the letter, the date caught my eye. December 22nd, the day after I desperately prayed that prayer of surrender. Miracles always happen in God's timing. God instructed Moses to write down the events of their wilderness wandering to remind future generations of the miracles he performed. Yet that first generation of Israelites did not enter the promised land due to their unbelief. Despite their disobedience, God was faithful to keep His covenant through the next generation. As my husband and I reflected on our 10-year wilderness experience, we can see evidence of God's continual provision and protection. We counted numerous times we almost lost our jobs, but God's grace intervened. His mighty hand moved to people unknowingly help us. God is truly faithful, even when our faith falters. The end. Happy Memorial Day, everybody. And I hope you have a great weekend tomorrow, because everybody gets an extra day to rest. And that's all for today. So let's see, what's my quote? Oh, be kind, be happy, don't see anyone's joy, and don't let anyone steal yours.